Hello, everyone. Welcome back today. Hopefully, the world's treating you okay. But today, we're going to talk about beef quality grading in Intro to Animal Science. This is a way for us to identify animals post harvest, of try to get them in similar eating qualities, which we'll talk about going forward. But today, we're going to talk about beef quality grading. We're going to try to discuss it and visit with you about it, and then we're going to try to practice a little bit. So maybe you can find the long lost career you're looking for that would benefit you in your life for a while. But first thing we need to ask ourselves: what are quality grades? Quality grade is the purpose to grade and to also break down the beef industry into groups of beef that will give similar eating experiences. So as we grade these carcasses, we now have a way to sort them according to their grade. So we can now segment each division, each carcass, into similar eating qualities. And that's where I want to get with the palatability. So when we look at a quality grade, that should give us the overall palatability of that actual carcass. And if we define palatability is the overall eating experience of a product. Now, when we talk about palatability, we are looking specifically at flavor, juiciness, and tenderness. Those are the three things that most consumers worry about, and that's what we try to worry about in the industry. So if we look at the parts of the quality grade, the first one is marbling. Marbling is also the intermuscular fat within the actual meat or the longissimus dorsi muscle, which we'll see coming forward. And we look at the maturity. We look at the overall age of the animal, and we really look at the skeletal maturity and the lean maturity. Skeletal is no more than the bones of the carcass. We can age a carcass pretty close on their age, because we do know that the older the animal, the lower the palatability is, mainly on the tenderness side and flavor that the consumer will be able to enjoy. And then we also look at lean maturity, because when a consumer buys a steak, a consumer is putting emotional thought into it, to looking at that steak and saying, you know what, I think that one looks good, or you know what, wow, that's a really good piece of meat. So the way the color of the lean and how coarse fibered it is as far as the muscle fibers go, that all comes into play. But when we talk about marbling, that'll be the first big thing we try to discuss, is marbling versus seam fat. Marbling is the intermuscular fat in the meat that does not touch the edges. And we'll see a picture coming up of what the difference is. Now, seam fat is basically the fat in the meat that does, but it touches the edges. Now, when we talk about seam fat, most muscles within the beef carcass or an animal carcass as a whole, there's always some type of tissue. Now, some of it's very thin, some of it could be a lot of fat tissue that lines in between all those muscles. And so when we're seeing that seam fat, we're actually seeing a definition or a line that we can essentially draw to say this is one muscle group or a muscle, and then here is another muscle. But as we look at marbling, we see this yellow arrow pointing to that big white speck of fat. That is marbling. This is a very good ribeye right here is what we're looking at. But if we notice, we do still have all these other little specks of fat. Now, all of those are marbling too. They don't have to be that big. Anywhere from the little bitty ones all the way to the great big ones, those are all marbling. Now, when we try to discuss seam fat right here, none of this fat that you see me tracing with my cursor, or where this yellow line is at, we don't count that as actual marbling. And this stuff, we can't count any marbling in here. Just what's in this muscle right here. This is the longissimus dorsi. Also, I might refer to it as the LD. But this is the muscle that basically runs, if you look at the back of a cow or of an animal, and you see as they walk, because they're four-legged, you have it should be a very straight line across their back. this is actually the muscle you're seeing. So the height of the animal would be right down here, and this right here in a picture you can see the white lines. That's actually the ribs. So this is the internal body cavity right here where vital organs may have been at before, or the digestive system as well. But when we look at marbling scores, we try to put a technical term with it. And our technical terms we try to use is abundant, moderately abundant, all the way down to devoid. Now, abundant is the absolute best. Devoid is the worst. So these are all different degrees of marbling that a carcass can have. Now, we have two pictures right there in front of you. One is probably practically devoid, or maybe even traces. That's on the left side of the screen. Now on the right side of the screen, we may be looking at the small or even the modest grade, depending on what it looks like a little closer. But that's what we try to do. We assign them a marbling score to begin with. That's one of the first things we do. And we're going to go through some pictures now that are going to basically just give us an overview of what that marbling looks like at different degrees of marbling within carcasses. So here's moderately abundant. We're not going to see an abundant, but moderately abundant. We see there is a lot of intermuscular fat or marbling right in here. Now we can't count this right here. That's what we consider seam fat. But that is a ton of marbling right there. Now most consumers, we're going to call this a prime. Most consumers would love this. That's where they would want to be if it hits their price point correctly. So this one is probably going to bring the biggest dollar value on a per pound basis compared to some other ones we're going to look at down the line. As we look at this picture, this slightly abundant ribeye, we notice there's a lot less marbling. We see more red, less white. So that's the difference. If we have more red than white, we start to knock it down on the overall quality grade when we're trying to evaluate it. As we get to moderate, we just keep seeing, and the modest, we just keep seeing a lot less marbling actually available in there. Now when you get to slight right here, this is what we're going to call our selects, which is a quality grade, which we'll talk about coming forward. So once we get through and we actually try to discuss all our marbling scores, the next thing we need to look at that we talked about before is maturity scores. Now maturity scores are A, B, C, D, and E. Now that's a very easy test question for me to write, so it might be a very good one for you to try to remember for the exam that might be coming up. But A and B we consider young beef, but anything C through E is what we consider old beef. And there is a large price difference between the A and B maturities and the C and D maturities. Most of the time, you don't get an opportunity to buy a C and D quality product. They may go into further processed, maybe our sausages or ground beef, things like that, where we don't have near as much palatability issues as before. So as we look at skeletal maturity is based off the average amount of ossification in a top 3 thoracic vertebrae, and we will look at pictures of that here momentarily. So if we look at our A and B, which is still considered young beef, we can have up to 5% for A and anywhere between 5 to 35%. So we take those top 3 buttons that we'll see coming forward and actually look at them, evaluate them, average them out, and that tells us our percent ossification, and then they fall into these groups right here. And so once we do that, we get a lot better idea of the potential eating quality that carcass has for the actual consumer. Because at the end of the day, that's our job. Our job in the animal industry is to try to help and provide wholesome products, safe products for the consumers, so they want to come eat it again. That's what builds a good market. But as we look, trying to average those out, we look at the average of the top 3, these little buttons right here where these arrows are pointing. We take those and average them out. So if it's 5, 10, and 15, well, that's probably going to average out to about 10. So it really just depends how it all works out. But you just look at them, average them out. It's a simple formulation that you just do math, and it tells you where we're at. And so then we can assign it the A, B, C, D, or E according to the maturity. Another thing we look at is the lean maturity that goes in the maturity score. Lean maturity is based off the color of the lean and the ribeye. Now what you're seeing is A color lean. The best it can be, it's what we consider a bright, youthful cherry red color. That is that most consumers really like. All the things that we evaluate are basically put into play by the consumer at some point in time in previous years. So we're always trying to collect that data. What does the consumer want? What are they looking at? How do they evaluate it? Because we need to make sure we can hit those targets and maybe hit that definition, or maybe we need to do more education as an industry. But when we look at the actual quality grades we assign them, once we have everything, is we look at prime, choice, and select and standard as our quality grades that we look for young beef. Now if we get in the old beef, we're looking at commercial, utility, cutter, and canner. A lot of times you don't get to buy those. Those are going to go into the further processed products that aren't made, like sausages or ground beef, stuff like that. You won't see a whole lot of that come out in steaks. So when you buy steaks, you're mainly looking at the prime, choice, select, and standard product. So as we look at quality grades and we have that marbling score, this is how everything kind of equates out. If we're looking at abundant, that's going to be our high prime, our best of the best. If we look at the devoid, we're going to look at the low standard. So, and we also notice that within each grade, there's a high, average, and low in some instances, and then some there's just select, or even high standard, low standard. Just kind of really depends on what that product looks like. And so even within most of those marbling scores, we differentiate in between those is it on the high end of that or the low end of that. So if you have an abundant, any of the abundance, whether it's abundant, moderately abundant, or slightly abundant, all those are eligible for prime. Now then we just look at, is it slight, is it moderately, or is it just abundant? And then we get to put on that low, average, or high prime within the industry. But A maturity carcasses are eligible for all beef grades. So essentially you could have prime, choice, select, standard, cutter, and canner carcasses if they're A maturity. Typically that's not going to be the case. They're going to be, if they're A maturity, they're going to be no worse than standard in my opinion. Now if we look at B maturity carcasses are not eligible for the select grade. So if we have a carcass as far as maturity score goes and it comes out to the B, so 5 to 35% ossification, B maturity carcasses can either go standard or they have to be a lot better than that for them to be in the choice range. Through research and data, they figured out that if they're B, take them out of select, 9 times out of 10 they're probably going to go on the standard side of things, just because they're a little older and their age is going to show a little bit, and it's going to show to the consumer as well. But if we look for old beef, this is where we get into the C, D, and E maturity grades like we have right across the top. And then if we look over here at our quality grades, even though we might be abundant or slightly abundant like we see right here in the D and E, their age, even though they could be eligible for prime if they were young, but however they're now old, they're going to be considered on the commercial side of things. So when you look right here on the E's and a really slight marbling, not a whole lot there, you're going to be low utility. That's probably, this one right here is probably the worst carcass you could have. None of these you probably would never see in a grocery store except for in a ground beef, a further processed type setting. Now let's just go through and look at a few of these and just talk about them. So here's a high prime, very good loin eye or ribeye area, Look at all the large specks of fat in there, and we still see some small minor ones in there. And as we move down the chain, we just notice that we get less and less marbling. We have to remember this seam fat right here does not count in this one, and I probably wouldn't count that one right there as well, because it kind of touches right there just to be on the safe side, as well as this right here. So that's probably what knocks it down to the average prime versus the high prime range. We look at the low prime. We definitely see quite a bit of difference of marbling in between the average and low. If you train your eye enough, and this takes practice and practice and practice, people that do this every day will see 6,000 or 5,000 head of cattle a day. They do this. And so it's easy to see small variances. You may not see it right now, but if you study these pictures over and over and over, you will start to see huge differences. Now here we get to average choice, or low choice, excuse me. This low choice right here, we do notice that we have quite a few dead spots. So if we look right here, here's a dead spot. Here's kind of one right here where there's hardly any marbling. So that's what's going to throw them into the low choice category. And so as we keep going through these, we're just going to drop in the quality grade that's actually presented on these carcasses, because as they drop, we are going to see a drop in palatability, that juiciness, that tenderness, that flavor of that product for the consumer. Here we have high select. We can see there's hardly any fat, any at all within there. As we look at this low select, very heavily muscled loin eye, pretty large. That loin eye is probably a 15 or 16 square inch loin eye. And we'll talk about what that means in the yield grading side next time. But we just noticed there's a lot less marbling that shows up. Now here we get to our standard grade, still young beef, but hardly any marbling in there at all. We're going to consider all of these to be A maturity. We're not going to throw in any hiccups right now. And then we get to our low standard, pretty low, not hardly any marbling in that longissimus dorsi muscle right here at all. So this one probably wouldn't have the best eating experience according to the standards that we do. So now we're going to go through a few slides, and we're actually going to look at the overall quality grade, and we're going to. I want you to try to put a quality grade on it. So hopefully you have some pen and paper handy. Pull it out and get ready. We're gonna assume whatever maturity score is right here in the bottom corner. We're gonna go with that. And so I want you to call the marbling on it, and then we'll see the overall quality grade that are actually out there. And I'll give you a few seconds to write it down and to maybe study it a little bit before we move forward. So here's our first one. We're going to consider it A maturity. Just take a quick second and try to evaluate it before we move forward. All right, so A maturity, eligible for all beef grades. If we look at the actual ribeye area right in here, we're going to call that probably a low choice today. Now these loin eyes, as they're processed and they rib them in between the 12th and 13th rib to present this loin eye, they actually bloom a little bit. So they get better over a shorter period of time between when they're ribbed and when they actually are presented to the grader. So this is done probably 30-45 minutes in advance. They let them bloom, and the colors really become more definable for us to look at. So here is practice number 2. Consider this A maturity. Pretty small loin eye, but quite a bit of marbling in there. All right, So A maturity, eligible for everything. If we look at that, if you took my hint, pretty high quality loin eye right there. That is what we consider a low prime. That's a pretty good ribeye. Make a fat man fatter all day, that's for sure. Our next one, A maturity. So pretty standard, just keep them young, eligible for everything. And just to be helping your train of thought out, how much marbling do you see within that loin eye area? So to answer my question, is not a whole lot. You see a few small flakes right here, but pretty low on the quality grade overall. So we're going to call this one high standard. So the high standard is going to be a cheaper product to hit a cheaper price point for the consumer out there. Here we go. Here's our D maturity. So we know that it's super old. We're going to consider it old beef, so it's not eligible for any prime, choice, select, or standard. Average marbling. And if we look, we're going to call that high utility. Now what puts it into the high utility is our maturity score. Even though if this was a maturity carcass, this would be probably a low choice ribeye. Because of its maturity, we're actually going to knock it down a notch to a lower quality grade beef product. Here we go. We have B maturity. So basically, they're not because it's a B maturity. It's not eligible for the select range. So it can either go standard or it can go choice. Not a whole lot of fat in that ribeye area. And we're going to go high standard because it does not have a whole lot of marbling in there for it actually to become a choice product. Even though it could get there, it has the option to. It does not present enough for us. So we're going to go high standard with this one. And so this is all I have for you today. Thank you all for tuning in. Hopefully everybody's staying safe and healthy. Look forward to hearing from y'all. If y'all have any questions, please feel free to let me know. And thank y'all for your time today.